recollections. And it's quite appropriate because Advent is the season for recollections and for prayer and for preparation for the great feast of Christmas, which is to come. And so I gladly accepted. And it's a pity the general could not join me, but he has so many pressing obligations. I thought when we left the presidency, it would be, things would lighten up, it would be different. But instead, it's a steady stream of someone asking for a recommendation or a suggestion what to plant or advice in some form or another. So his time, I'm afraid, is not his own. But I was most pleased to be able to attend because Advent is a very favorite season of mine. I've always enjoyed the preparations for the Christmas season. And of course, Christmas Day itself. But I don't know how it is here in Connecticut, but in Virginia, we celebrate the 12 days of Christmas. We call it Christmas Tide. And it's a time of partying and horse racing and all kinds of social obligations. Everybody's visiting somebody else. I used to wonder if anybody was left to home because everybody was visiting. And then of course it's also time for weddings. I know the Jeffersons were married on New Year's Day, part of the Christmas Tide. But I have two Christmases that, in fact, I've always thought that one of the advantages of, if you want to call it that, of getting to one's mature age is the recollections that we have, the memories we have that we can call on to just savor them and so on. And Christmas is a perfect time for recollections. And I have two Christmases that are even of more importance to me than the others, although the others are quite necessary too. But the idea of just savoring the memories. But in order to do that, I would have to give you a bit of background on myself. You see, I was married at the age of 17, quite a young person to be married, and I was married to a very fine gentleman, Daniel Park Custis. His father was John Custis of the Eastern Shore and Williamsburg. I've often thought his father might have had a little more ambitious plans for his son, but nevertheless, we were married, and it was a very happy union. We were quite suited for each other, and we were blessed with 4 little children, and life seemed to be quite favorable, you see. But after a time, sadness came into our lives, and the first 2 children, the Lord decided to call them back home. It was indeed a very sad time, but once I had recovered from the grief of those happenings, then my husband too was stricken, most suddenly, most unexpected, and I found myself to be a widow at the age of 6 and 20, with the 2 remaining children, little toddlers really, and much property to oversee. Now, as far as the household and the children was concerned, I had been well prepared. My mama was most diligent in teaching me my housewifery skills, as we call it in Virginia. And I was quite prepared to manage a household and to manage the 2 little children. But the acres and acres of land and the planting and the harvesting and the decisions to make as to what to plant where, and so I had no training for that at all, nor would any young lady of my time. But you probably would say, well, certainly, Ms. Custis, you had advisors. Oh yes, indeed I did. But the scene always seemed to be the same. Now, Ms. Custis, we could take this plan of action and then this would happen and this would be the result. Or we could do it this way and you could instigate this type of action and the results would be a bit different, so on. Now, the choice, madam, is up to you. But you see, I didn't want the choice. I had no preparation in how to make the choice. But nevertheless, I got through the first year of widowhood. Time goes on, and I was feeling a bit more comfortable. But it was early spring, early March, that first glimmer of hope for springtime to come. And I saw Mr. Chamberlain, Colonel Chamberlain, I should say, ride over to me. He was my next door neighbor. And he came over to invite me to dinner on the morrow. He and his wife were having a group of friends in, and how did he put it? Oh yes, he told me that it would do me well to renew old acquaintances. I was later to find out that matchmaking was what he really did. So of course I accepted the gracious invitation, and on the morrow I rode over to the Chamberlains, only to find out that my host had gone down to the ferry landing, and I thought, what on earth for? Well, he had found out somehow, he never did tell me, but he had found out that young Colonel Washington was crossing the Pamunkey River on his way back from the French territory out to the western part of the colonies. And he was to go to Williamsburg to make his report to the governor on the happenings out to the west and so on. And Colonel Chamberlain had gone down to intercept him and invite him to dinner. And he told him that there was a comely widow and to be in the company. I was the only widow present, but be that as it may. Colonel Washington accepted the invitation. He was hard put not to. And he came and joined the company, and dinner proceeded quite pleasantly. We had a grand discussion about this and that and so on, and everything went smoothly. And Colonel Washington told us about some escapades out to the west. I think he adjusted them a bit for the ladies' ears, but anyway. And then after dinner, it was, as I say, a first glimmer of spring, and everybody was eager to be outside. And the guests decided they would take a ramble about the gardens, see what was blossoming or starting to blossom. Well, I had just recovered from a bit of the ague, and I was a little leery about venturing out. It was still a nip in the air, so I thought I would be much more comfortable into the parlor and settled next to the fire. Well, Colonel Washington joined me, and we had a delightful conversation for a time when suddenly he bolted upright and muttered something about getting on to Williamsburg and seeing the governor and so forth and so on. And at the same moment, the door burst open, and there was Colonel Chamberlain telling him that he was not to leave the house. I've often wondered if he had his ear pressed to the door. The timing was too perfect. So anyway, he told Colonel Washington, Colonel Chamberlain is rather short in stature, and he put his arm up and when told him, he said that your horse has been bedded down, your man has been given accommodations, everything's taken care of. You have no choice but to stay here the night, and you can leave in the morning. Well, what could poor Colonel Washington do but acquiesce, you see? And of course, that's precisely what happened. And somebody told me that the sun was high in the sky the next morning when the colonel finally set his horse toward Williamsburg. He paid me 2 more calls that spring, and by June, I was sending my order to my agent over in London, and I was including a few items that would be appropriate for a bride. Now, you keep in mind, Mount Vernon is up to the northern neck, as we call it in Virginia, the very top part of the colony. Well, it was a colony then, at any rate. And I lived on the Pamunkey River, up way out to the western part of the southern part, southwest part of Virginia. So it was not an easy ride at all. But he managed it several times that summer and that fall. And soon we were talking about being married. And I wanted a wedding on January the 6th. I told you that was the end of Christmas tide. And so we settled on that date. And I, of course, had my 2 children and so on. And we planned that then we would leave for Mount Vernon and we would start a new life. Can you imagine my happiness that Christmas, knowing full well that my wedding was to be in a few more days, and a new life to start, a new person to share not only the joys but to share the sufferings as well in life. My mother once told me that a sorrow shared is cut in half, but a joy shared is doubled. And my joy was doubled indeed. My heart was just full of happiness. I don't ever recall feeling so wonderfully happy. So that is one of my very favorite Christmases indeed. And so the wedding took place on January 6th, the 12th night. And then we waited until the beginning of April to go to Mount Vernon, and the travel would be better then. And Mount Vernon, I will tell you, did not look anything at all like it does today. At that time, it was a mere bachelor's quarters, not quarters, but a bachelor's cottage, and a story and a half. And he assured me it would be changed and he would add on to it and so on, which of course he has done. And it has become quite a proper home for a member of the House of Burgesses, which he was at the time. So life was fairly well settled for us, you see. I had my 2 little children. Oh, and the important thing was that he promised me he was laying the uniform aside for good. No more soldiers. No, indeed. He was to be a gentleman farmer with his own fig and vine. He liked that biblical phrase. And so it went on as that for a time. But sometimes life does not take the path that we wish it to, or that we hope it will, or that we plan on it. And it certainly did not in this case, because the war clouds began to gather. And things became more and more of concern. The British were in Boston, and they wouldn't go home. And the Congress didn't know what to do. And so they kept having these sessions. And finally, Colonel Washington decided he thought he should attend the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and that he would go. And I didn't think that much of it. Let's see, Mr. Patrick Henry and Mr. Edmund Pendleton came to collect him. And the next morning they left for Philadelphia. And I remember standing in the doorway waving goodbye. And I called out to them, "Be firm, boys. I know George will." I don't know where I had the nerve to say it, but I couldn't help myself. So he was in Philadelphia. And of course I expected him home, and he expected to come home as soon as the session was finished. But you may well know that that's not what happened. No, indeed. He was appointed as Commander-in-Chief of all of the American forces. And he left in due time, after a brief period of preparation. He left for Boston. He was not to come home to Mount Vernon, or maybe 2 brief visits for the ensuing 8 years. Instead, he sent me a letter. I think I have it with me. I will share it for you in a moment. Well, the more I thought about it as the time wore on, the more I thought, well, if he's not going to come home, perhaps I could go to Cambridge. I asked Jackie, my son. Oh, he was all for it. I kind of knew he would be. And so eventually we started to pack wagons and prepare for our trip to Cambridge. Blankets and medical supplies and foodstuffs and whatever we thought could be useful, we packed in the wagons. And Jackie cautioned me. "Mama," he said, "it's 600 miles. I don't know how he knew that, but it's 600 miles to Cambridge." All right, it's 600 miles. Taverns along the way are not too conducive for a lady to make her arrangements, but we would manage. And so we did. We went to Cambridge, and that was Christmas of 1774. And little did I dream I was to make a similar venture for the next 7 winters. After Cambridge came, I've written it down because I can't remember it anymore. But after Cambridge came New York, Morristown, Valley Forge, Philadelphia, Middleborough, New Windsor, and Newburgh. Every one of them, we packed the wagons and we went to wherever the troops were, because there's no fighting in the winter time, you see, so it was, from that standpoint, it was a safe venture. But there was a little small piece of amusement though here. I received a letter very shortly after I arrived at Cambridge from Mrs. Mercy Otis Warren of Boston. Somehow she had found out that I was ensconced in the camp, and I think, judging from her letter, she did not approve. She offered me her accommodations to come and join her at her home. I had not traveled all the way to Cambridge to pay call on Mrs. Warren. So I wrote back and thanked her, most exceedingly grateful for her invitation, and should it become necessary, and so on and so forth. But we've always kind of been amused by the incident because, well, it was wartime, and things, the demands of the times dictate your conduct, I think, to some extent anyway. So the war wore on, and finally things turned around. 1781 was the victory at Yorktown, and I was so hoping that the treaty could be signed then, but instead it went on for 2 more years. Finally, 1783, the treaty was signed in Paris, and the colonists had won their 7 years' war. All right. Now General Washington is in Boston. No, forgive me, not Boston, in New York. And of course, it's the beginning of December, so I had no concerns at all. Certainly he would be home by Christmas time. It was a full several weeks involved, you see. Well, I was to learn that it wasn't quite that simple. December the 4th at Fraunces Tavern in New York City, where you can still visit. I think it's appropriate for ladies anyway. He bade farewell to his officers. I understand it was quite an emotional evening, and very, very teary-eyed some of those gentlemen were. Well, they were never to see each other again, they knew that. And after saying goodbye to the officers, he got into a boat and went across the Hudson River to New Jersey. And then he went down he had to resign his commission in Philadelphia. All right, but he would be home by Christmas, he kept promising. Each letter, the couriers would bring me these letters. I will be home by Christmas. Well, after, what is it, my geography is not very accurate, but after Philadelphia and then Delaware and Maryland, and anyway, you can well imagine, you can fill in the blanks that I can't think of here, all the different places he had. But every place he went, they wanted to feed him with a ball, a dinner, a dance, something, a puppet show, anything to show their appreciation for what he had done and leading the troops all those 8 years, you see. And meanwhile, I'm at Mount Vernon looking out the windows. But I will be home by Christmas. Finally, it's the 23rd of December. He had spent 2 days in Annapolis because of the social goings on, you see. The weather did not look very promising. The skies looked rather heavy. Anyway, on December the 24th, they looked even heavier, obviously with snow. It was when you know well that the winter's darkness, it comes quite early, you see. So we put candles in all the windows. What else could we do? And we waited. And finally, toward evening, on the 24th of December, he came home. He was home to Mount Vernon, and the war was over. And the next morning we woke up, and the mansion had been snowed in with ice and snow, and we weren't to go out anywhere. And I will tell you, we spent a most happy, joyous, unmilitary Christmas. And you could feel, it was palpable even, you could feel the joy throughout the household. So those, I'm happy to share with you, are my two very favorite Christmases. And I've often thought, of course, we then decided that was finishing his public service. No more public office. Oh no, indeed. He was again to retire to this fig and vine that he keeps talking about, you see. And I've often thought, though, of course, the presidency loomed, and when he was asked, you know quite well that he did not turn that down. He felt it was his duty. But I always had a bit of reservation, because I felt that I was in a position, not wanting to be, with which so many younger and gayer ladies would be most prodigiously pleased. But sometimes life doesn't turn out the way we think it should, so to speak. So I'm so happy to share with you my first Christmas of 1759 on the 12th night of January the 6th, my wedding day. And then this past Christmas of 1780, where are we now? 83, yes. That too was so momentous and so joyous. So I thank you most kindly for your gracious attention. And if you have any queries, I would be happy to address them. But I would like to read you the letter from Mrs. Warren, if you would be so interested. I think it's a bit, I think I brought it with me. Oh, I also brought with me the letter that he sent me from Philadelphia. Would you like to hear that? Yes. I think perhaps it might be interesting to you. Yes, this is it. June the 8th of 1775. He says, "My dearest, I am now set down to write you on a subject which fills me with inexpressible concern. This concern is greatly aggravated when I reflect upon the uneasiness I know it will give to you. It has been determined in the Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care, and that it is necessary for me to proceed immediately to Boston to take upon me the command of this army. You may believe me, my dear Patsy, when I assure you in the most solemn manner that so far from seeking this opportunity, I have used my every endeavor in my power to avoid it. Not only from my unwillingness to part with you and the family, but from a conscientiousness of its being a trust too great for my capacity." Well, I never believed that for a moment. "And that I should enjoy more real happiness and fidelity in 1 month with you at home than I have the most distant prospect of reaping abroad, if my stay were to be 7 times 7 years. But as it has been a kind of destiny that has thrown me upon this service, I shall hope that my undertaking of it is designed to answer some good purpose. You might, and I suppose did, perceive from the tenor of my letters that I was apprehensive, that I could not avoid disappointment, as I did not even pretend to intimate when I should return. That was the case. It was totally out of my power to refuse this appointment without exposing my character to such censures as would have reflected dishonor upon myself and given pain to my friends. This, I am sure, could not and ought not be pleasing to you. I must have learned something considerably in my own estate. I shall rely, therefore, confidently for the providence which has heretofore preserved that I have been bountiful to and so on and so forth. I want to get to the part that I shall feel no pain from this toil in the danger of the campaign. My unhappiness will flow from the uneasiness I know you will feel at being left alone. I beg of you to summon your whole fortitude, resolution, and pass your time as agreeably as possible. And nothing will give me so much sincere satisfaction as to hear this, and to hear it from your own pen. Well, no concern there, I wrote, of course. But the letter to Mrs. Warren, I hope I have it. Oh, there's a second letter that he wrote for, this is the letter I returned to her. Mrs. Washington presents her respectful compliments to Mrs. Warren and thanks her most cordially for her polite enquiry and exceeding kind offer. If the exigency of affairs in this camp should make it necessary for her to remove, she cannot but esteem it a happiness to have so friendly an invitation as Mrs. Warren has given. The General begs that his best regards may be presented to Mrs. Warren, and joins me in wishing her and her family every happiness that is or can be derived from a speedy and honorable peace. So I told her thank you. Any questions that